advice. Good morning to all of you. Thank you for coming. So just to start us off, Gillian Cooper, if I can come to you first. As we start to go into this winter, what is the current state of the kind of consumer body around energy bills from what you've been seeing? We've been hearing concerns around self-disconnection. We'll be talking about prepayment meters, debt levels. Presumably there's going to be a legacy of the energy crisis that we'll need to think about. What does that look like at the moment?
So 2022 was a year unlike any other we've seen because we had a cost of living crisis go from bad to worse. At Citizens Advice, we were breaking unwelcome records pretty much every month last year with regard to the number of people we were helping who were in crisis situations. In December, it was more than 3 people every minute with crisis support, and that's food vouchers, fuel vouchers, other charitable aid. The number of people we helped who were struggling to afford their energy bills is completely unprecedented. We also saw a record rise in December of the number of people who couldn't afford to top up their prepayment meter. It was more than what we'd seen in the previous 10 years combined. And to us, we think that suggests that the government support package has not been enough to keep people's heating and lights on. And we think that low-income households are paying the price for a broken energy market here. And where that has sort of had a real impact is people who pay by prepay. It has, up until this point, been a payment method that has functioned pretty well for millions of households, but it's now much, much riskier because of the sort of sky-high energy bills and cost of living crisis. And whilst people have valued the control it's given them over how much they spend on energy, it has become a crisis for quite a number of households, and we published a report earlier this month that showed that millions of people had disconnected from their prepayment meter at least once a year, and a number of very vulnerable households were disconnecting regularly and for extended periods of time, and that included people who disabled people or people with a long-term health condition. So we've called for a temporary a moratorium on the forced installation of prepayment meters until we can put some new protections in place to support people who are struggling to afford their energy bills.
Thank you. And Peter Smith, does that sound right from your perspective? Are those the types of customers we need to think about additional support for, people on low incomes, vulnerable households, households with disability requirements, and prepayment meter customers? Is that right?
Yeah, I think that sounds like a very familiar picture. We're a small advice provider in contrast to Citizens Advice, but we've seen record numbers of people coming to us asking for support, and the devastating impact this winter has been really acute. Just to say something briefly about the agencies that are there to support those households, I think they're facing unprecedented challenges, really struggling with increased demand for services, a lack of tools in the toolkit in terms of what we can do to support those households. The other thing I would observe is an increased concern from other statutory bodies that haven't historically interfaced on energy issues, particularly fire and rescue services are reporting real huge increase in instances of people doing unsafe things in their home in a desperate attempt to keep warm. And that's having a big impact on their thinking about responding to the wider cost of living crisis. But in terms of the groups you've highlighted, yeah, I think that those are the main groups. The real weakness in our current approach to targeting is not being able to support those households that live on the lowest incomes but don't claim any means-tested benefits, and how that then intersects with other vulnerabilities like medical conditions, etc. Those are the most vulnerable people that are still waiting for a significant amount of support to get through this situation.
And that presumably is because energy companies or the government can't easily just pull up a list of those customers and send help to them, right?
We do have the Priority Services Register, and we've been urging the government to look at that as a way of targeting more support towards those households. But unfortunately, those Priority Services Registers haven't been kept up to date, and there hasn't been as much proactive work by energy suppliers as there have been for network companies, for example, who have been using those as more active tools to support customers.
Pinchbeck, is that right? Energy suppliers haven't been keeping their priority lists up to date.
I think the thing that's missing in what Gillian and Pete said, though I'd echo much of what they said, I don't think anyone is pretending that there isn't an energy crisis on and that bills aren't exceptionally high and that people aren't struggling, is the scale of it. So in our call centres, calls are up about 300% on previous years. And the requests for additional support are up 300% too. And what that indicates is we've got many more houses moving into what has been considered vulnerability previously at pace, and or households who are not indicating to us that they're vulnerable. So I think from the suppliers, there's an acceptance that more needs to be done in the vulnerability space, and we're working actively with the consumer groups and government to do that. But I would say that this is a much bigger problem than just prepayment meters of vulnerable customers. Bills are still double what they were 18 months ago, and we've got about 12 million households, which is about 40% of customers spending more than 10% on energy. That's the previous definition of fuel poverty. So I think we need to look at targeted support, but we also need to look at this as an affordability crisis across the piece and how that intersects with wider cost of living. And we're up for having those conversations, but I don't think it is as simple as just looking at the priority services register. I think this is still a really big problem.
How do we fix that? I mean, you say you're working with government on it. How do we find those customers that need help?
So, and I mean, it'll be interesting to hear from Pete and Gillian on this too, but what we have done, we've been flagging with government the risks around vulnerability and prepayment customers, I think before I went on maternity leave, so for 2 years now. And then since the autumn, we've been asking for specific meetings on these issues in particular.
Sorry to ask, but have you had those meetings with ministers?
We have. So we had a meeting with the minister last week. We called for it before Christmas. We've put in some proposals that we're working through with consumer groups, with Ofgem and the minister. So they're draft at this stage. I've also shared them with committee clerks, so you know that I'm not just making this up, so you can have a look yourself in draft form. The kinds of things we're talking about doing is enforcing the existing licence conditions. It's worth saying it's 250-page supplier licence. The steps that should be taken to get to the kind of prepayment install point are extensive. Similarly with identifying vulnerable customers, if rules are being broken, we want to know about them, they should be enforced. I think there's a question about Ofgem capacity there that we have raised with government. And then on top of that, we're proposing kind of codifying and setting out some principles that go further than the licence for how we treat vulnerable and prepayment customers. That's what's up for discussion with government. And then we're calling on more support. So the energy price guarantee is due to basically be raised in April. We think that that should be fixed to £2,500 for the rest of the year. There's an underspend on that programme against what was budgeted because gas prices have fallen. We're also calling, like the consumer groups, for some kind of targeted support in addition to that. So we're very up for conversations about things like social tariffs. And we've written to the Chancellor to call for the kind of long-term picture on bills to be sorted by investing in green infrastructure, but also in energy efficiency and doing some things on VAT to make that easier. So I suppose the short answer to this is we're doing lots behind the scenes and as much as we think that we can, given the debt burden on the sector, to try and help our customers without saying at all that if rules are being broken, that's excusable.
Can I check I understood correctly? So you represent energy suppliers.
Yes.
And you've just asked for the regulator to be tougher with your own companies. Why can't you just do the job properly in the first place?
So we expect our member companies to be doing their job properly in the first place, but I think what we're saying is if the regulator or citizens advice or consumer groups are seeing things that the suppliers don't see, that should be raised and sorted. To give you an example of why there might be a gap, we're the energy suppliers, so quite often people don't tell us when they're vulnerable because they either don't know that help exists or they're more comfortable having these conversations with people like Gillian and Pete. So in the past, when issues have been raised with us, often it's an issue of communication. And then I think even when they're talking to us, quite often they don't know exactly what the definitions of vulnerability are. So in the process of then, when those cases are raised with the suppliers, we often then find a reason they were vulnerable when we previously ruled out that they weren't, that then means that we can support them. So it's not to say that there isn't bad practice going on, and if there is, we want to see that stamped out. We're an industry that fundamentally serves people. It's an essential service. And we've got a regulator that should be doing that job with very extensive rules they should be enforcing. But I think it's also the case that suppliers can't do this on their own for reasons that are both behavioural and to do with regulation.
Okay. Ruth Edwards, please.
Thank you, Chair. Both Citizens Advice and National Energy Action have raised concerns that vulnerable customers are being forced onto prepayment meters when it's not safe or appropriate to do so, and that they're not being used as a last resort. Could you just sort of set out for us what you're seeing on the ground in this area?
Sure. So for us, there's three key groups of people who are struggling to top up their prepayment meters or at risk of being moved onto prepay that we're particularly concerned about. So the first is people with physical or mental health difficulties who will struggle to top up. because of affordability issues. We're also particularly concerned about households with young children or where there are elderly people who are more likely to suffer health consequences associated with being off supply. And the third group, which is more challenging, and I think this is something that Emma's members will need to grapple with, which is people who are on low incomes but don't currently have any physical or mental health difficulties, but they're unable to afford to keep the lights on, because when you live in a cold home, you suffer consequences as a result of that. If we think about the sort of scale of the challenge we've got for us, so in terms of the debt clients coming to Citizens Advice for support, 50% of those people have a negative budget, which means they cannot afford to pay for all their essential bills at this point, and they certainly don't have any money to start repaying debt. And so if you put a household in that situation onto prepay, they will probably disconnect themselves frequently. So that, in our view, it isn't safe for households in that situation to remain on prepay or be transferred to prepay just because of the risks. And we need to think about better ways to safeguard these households. And, you know, I accept the challenges Emma has raised about the sort of the challenges suppliers are facing with the sort of growing debt books that they've got. We agree with them. This isn't an issue that suppliers can solve on their own, but we do need to make a decision as a society, I think, about whether or not we're going to properly safeguard people in this situation, because energy is an essential for life service, and you really cannot live without it without having really detrimental effects to your health.
And I see that Citizens Advice have said you see a number of households forced onto prepay meters where the person either requires continuous supply of energy for health reasons, or they have accessibility needs and can't access the top-up point, or an illness or disability that's exacerbated in cold weather. Can you give us any sense of what proportion of customers being forced onto prepayment meters that would sort of entail?
I think I'd struggle to give a proportion. I think we see enough case studies, and certainly other advice agencies such as NEA and many others are seeing a worrying number of people who would fall into those vulnerable categories where it doesn't feel right or safe for them to be on prepay. So I think this is where we're looking for Ofgem's new review of protections in this space to really dig into that and try and understand the scale of the problem. Because until we know the size of the problem, we can't really work out the right solutions for how we fix this. So, you know, I think it's really important that Ofgem carries out proper sort of modelling of this so we get a good sense of the number.
Thank you. Peter Smith, how does that?
I think we are hamstrung at the moment because we haven't got as much reporting data out there as there used to be by Ofgem on these issues. But it tends to be about one fifth of customers are on the priority services register for the reasons that you've indicated. So that gives you a sense of the sort of scale of these potential issues.
Thank you. Emma Pinchbeck, what's the energy market's response, energy suppliers' response to those observations?
I mean, both the kind of cases you're talking about there would be breaches of licence conditions. So that's the point about. There are really strong rules around what happens in the process of putting someone onto a prepayment meter. And so if those rules are being broken, firstly, we want to know where the cases are and they should be raised with suppliers. But secondly, there's an Ofgem job to enforce those existing rules, which we've raised concerns about the regulator time and again with this committee and whether they're able to do that job properly. We are participating in Ofgem's kind of calls for evidence around these practices. There's been more requests for information issued before Christmas, so we'll do all we can to share that information. I think it's worth talking about debt again. So we think there's about £2.5 billion worth of debt sitting on suppliers' books right now. Those are figures we're also getting and supplying to government and to the regulator. Of that, we think bad debt might be close to 2 billion from independent experts. We are required to collect debt as part of the licence, and so that debt has to be collected off all bill payers if it's not being paid, and that's one of the reasons that things like a moratorium worry suppliers, because we have seen the consequences of failing suppliers already on bills, plus the need to collect debt from everyone else. So it's complex for us when we look at the market, but but that doesn't mean that we're not sympathetic to what is a devastating affordability problem for many households. So I'm not contradicting anything that Gillian and Peter are saying here. I think it's on all of us to work together to find the solution.
Thank you. I don't think anybody would disagree that the regulator should be properly resourced and should enforce things properly. But I mean, we have seen Ofgem, publish market compliance reviews on lots of different issues. And we've seen energy companies, come out and say quite publicly, Nigel Pocklington from Good Energy, for example, Ofgem is overcompensating for previous mistakes. The founder of So Energy, I believe, has also said over the course of the last 3 months, has again complained about Ofgem's market compliance review. Do you think there is a culture in the energy industry that sees customers as commodities rather than people?
Not in my experience of working for them, and I wouldn't be in this job if I did think that. As it happens, I've got family on prepayment meters who are in some of the situations described here, so if I have a vested interest at all, it's making sure that they're treated fairly. And my experience of working directly with supplier CEOs has been that they have been largely humane thinking about these problems, but they also are required to manage debt, and they are worried given the state of the retail sector in the UK. Just a reminder, the retail sector makes a negative margin in the UK on average. It was minus 2% last year, and that makes investing in things like call centres, investing in the additional help we'd like to provide, taking on things like making sure we understand vulnerability, all of those things difficult because we don't have the money in that bit of the industry to do it. So never in my experience of working with the CEOs have they come across as just, focused on the commercials. But it is a challenging sector in the UK. Lastly, the points that you made about So Energy and Good, that speaks again to a regulatory issue because they were right. The problem was the methodology Ofgem had used to label bad practice was basically incorrect, and they looked at it and called it out. And so they were unfairly named as being poor at responding to a customer base. And so that again speaks to, do they have the right skills in Ofgem to do this? Do they have the right capacity to do this? And I don't think any of us would say they definitely do at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Peter, I think you wanted to come in.
Just very briefly, I think the number of supplier exits that we've seen also helped the regulator in terms of enforcing the rules. Where there was a plethora of very small suppliers, it was probably quite difficult to keep track on what all of them were doing. But now we've seen that contraction again, I don't know how many licensees there are, forgive me, but something 12, 15, something like that must be a much easier task. We do, however, welcome their very recent commitment to create a work stream around identifying financial vulnerability. We think that's really important. Embedding that within the priority services register should help get across some of these issues that we've been talking about today.
Thank you. And Gillian Cooper, obviously Emma's raised a couple of issues with the idea of a moratorium on prepayment meters, increased bailiff action, increased bad debt. What's Citizens Advice's view on that? How could those be mitigated if such a policy as you're proposing is pushed?
So we called for the moratorium because we think the scale of bad practice is really concerning, and there's a need to focus the minds and start bringing in some proper solutions and some quick solutions. So I think, and it's also important to say that if people are willingly wanting to move over to prepay because they feel that is the right option for them, this wouldn't affect that in any way. This is the people we're concerned about are the ones who cannot afford to pay their energy bills, and prepay is likely to be a dangerous solution for them because they will regularly disconnect themselves. So I think it is right to take the time to try and bring in new protections to safeguard these households. And once those protections are in place, we can look at resuming forced installations of prepay, because this isn't about sort of stopping suppliers from using a tool to collect debt where that is appropriate. It is about ensuring we've got the right protections in place to safeguard people.
Thank you. Final word to Peter.
The BEIS Committee rightly highlighted the need for a proper plan around stopping self-disconnection. We agree with short-term steps that Citizens Advice are campaigning on, but we need a proper plan around looking at removing the amount of traditional prepay we've got out there, which are badly hindering access to government support at the moment, as well as other forms of support. looking to make sure that those prices for prepaid customers and other customers are fairer, and not doing more than just monitoring the numbers on how many people are regularly self-disconnecting. We think it's possible for the regulator and industry to come up with a coherent plan and really work towards the end of self-disconnection as a sickening part of our energy system.
Thank you. Can I just politely remind members, we've got about 5 minutes per question. If we overrun, it means less time with Ofgem, which I'm sure they'll be delighted about, but we would like to give them enough time at the end. Andy McDonald, please.
I'll go as quick as I can. I'm just pleased that we're hearing that suppliers are humane, because the ones that are left, because we have heard from others who wouldn't be characterised in that way. Can I ask some specifics around your experience of suppliers? And to kick us off, are they increasing customers' direct debits even when customers have built up large credit balances? I don't know if you've come across that, Gillian.
Sure. So we do have a lot of people contact us because they're confused about their energy bills. We have looked into this. We don't have any firm evidence of widespread sharp practice in this area. We do think suppliers need to do a much better job of ensuring their customers understand why their direct debits are increasing. I think we're in a particularly unique situation at the moment because we had a couple of very significant price increases in 2022. People's bills went up by a lot. We have also had people responding quite significantly to those increased prices by changing how much energy they use in their homes. A lot of people have significantly reduced how much energy they use because of cost issues. And I think there probably is a question for industry about sort of how quick they've been at reassessing those direct debits. Are they still doing it on a 6-monthly basis when actually quarterly might make sense? Are they being sufficiently flexible when they're customers and when they come and say, look, I can't afford that increase, and they do a proper investigation at that time rather than just sort of saying, well, that's what the algorithm tells us. So I think there is some bad practice. I don't think it's sort of widespread, deliberate inflating. I think it's just sort of customer service hasn't been up to scratch.
Did you come across that with the balance problem?
I find that it's typically a case of either not being particularly proactive about being transparent about the methodology, or in the case of households, understanding the bottom line in terms of the quantum. It's really difficult for households with very limited or increasingly limited budgets to say, I'm going to prioritise £300, £400 a month in my outgoings and give it to a supplier in advance. I mean, that's very difficult for households, and that speaks to a wider affordability problem as opposed to the mechanics of how direct debits have been calculated.
Okay.
Consequence of some of that is that we're seeing an increase in standard credit customers that pay by cash or by cheque. Those customers are currently paying a huge premium in the energy market due to the differentials in how the price cap works, over £250 per customer for those households that pay by cheque or by cash compared to those direct debit customers.
Can I roll that up and just ask Emma whether your findings are that there's sufficient attention paid to people's ability to repay debt as well as sitting on credit balances?
So, yes, that's something we obviously are very worried about, and again, it's one of the reasons that we think PPMs can be, prepayment meters can be a useful tool. Something we haven't said is that the industry does give out a lot of discretionary credit, and one of the reasons for that big debt book is that, particularly for prepayment customers, the industry generally only expects 50% of that to get paid back ever. So there's already a kind of a system where we think about what additional support we can offer people. That includes prepayment plans, changing payment plans, changing how they pay, discretionary credit, and then an expectation that for some households that we may not get that credit back. So I haven't it's something that suppliers worry about all the time, as you'd imagine, how they manage their debt book and how their customers are doing. As others have said, we don't have any evidence of sharp practice with how direct debits work. Totally agree that energy is really complex from where we look at it. We buy ahead, we hedge ahead. That's the responsible thing for companies to do. We've seen what happens when companies don't do that. But translating that to a customer payment monthly is obviously difficult, and explaining to customers why that is the case can be difficult.
So do you perceive that there is sufficient priority given to shifting people from legacy arrangements from prepayments onto direct. Is there sufficient attention paid to getting people off prepayment?
What we really would like to see, and it's been mentioned, we've been talking about dumb meters largely, and one of the tools that we would like to be able to use more is smart meters, and particularly smart prepay meters. So one of the commitments we have put forward to government is that we should be doing smart prepay first and trying to do that even when it's complicated for customers as much as possible. And the reason for that is it really helps us see when customers are changing their behaviour early. It can help us see if they're struggling with payment early, if they're changing their habits in their households, give us more information about our households, and relatedly help us manage the system more efficiently to bring bills down. So smart meters for everyone, critical infrastructure, could save 16 billion on the cost of reaching net zero, could help reduce bills, can help energy infrastructure, but for prepay customers, we think they could be really important. So that is partly a supplier job, but there's also a call for government to really, really look at the smart meter rollout and help get that going. They've always kind of slightly backed away from pushing it. Now's the time to do that.
Pete?
I think there was about 5 billion consumer worth of benefit in terms of shifting across to smart prepay, so massive and very clear benefits case, and we should be getting on with that and setting targets appropriately to deliver that outcome quickly. The other quick thing I'd say is we've heard a lot about households being automatically switched to prepayment mode. We would like to see suppliers embrace the opportunity to do more in terms of switching households temporarily over to credit mode, particularly where there's the sort of transient vulnerability caused by being in hospital, for example, or really struggling to manage your finances in a particular month. That could be a much more common way of helping customers.
And just to say we firmly agree with that, and it's something that we have asked the government and Ofgem to track through this process, through this new investigation process into prepayment, because it's really important that suppliers are able to demonstrate where they've identified vulnerability, that they are moving that customer off prepay.
Finally, just for Emma, you seem to be indicating that the suppliers just are struggling to have with their resources to actually meet these challenges.
Yeah.
What would happen how can we improve that situation? What has to happen?
I think I gave evidence in the autumn of 2021 as the suppliers were beginning to fail, that autumn that we lost 29 at the start of the gas price crisis. And I said then what I'll say now, which is that I've worked in energy for 10 years and I came to retail relatively late, and I have been shocked at the lack of attention on retail as a kind of vibrant, important part of the energy sector, and the relationship that the suppliers have with government and the regulator, which I would characterise as largely punitive. And so the best of the private sector is when they can make enough money to do things like innovate, invest in call centres, invest in support over and above the hundreds of millions they already give. But that's very, very difficult in a world where you're making negative margins. And just to give you an example of things that could be brilliant, 2 of my supplier members are now offering heat pumps for the same price as a gas boiler with a government grant. They've invested their resources in getting that cost down. They're training the installers to do that. In the last 2 weeks, we've had suppliers aggregating load in households to participate in flexibility trials with the grid. Again, those tariffs often come at a loss for suppliers because the structure of the market means that they can't do that innovation. They're paying their customers to do that. They're saving the grid money. All of this stuff, this kind of innovation on top of the customer support, identifying vulnerable people, looking after our customers, is easier when you've got a market that's functioning, and the market is not functioning. And I have been saying that pretty much since I got this job, and nothing has changed.
Thanks, Jeff.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just ask you?
I'm afraid not. Sorry, you're coming in after BIM, though, so you can come in then. BIM Afalami.
Thank you, Chair. So my question is directed particularly at Ms. Pinchbeck. I've got a huge amount of respect for you personally, as you know. And I think you're a class act. However, relating to some of your members, I have seen this, by the way, in my own constituency, in addition to what I'm about to say in relation to UK hospitality. So Emma Nicholls has said that many of her members, as hospitality businesses, report that suppliers offering rates above wholesale prices, hiking standing charges, demanding large deposits, and I quote, "The behaviour of energy suppliers over the past 4 months has been nothing short of disgraceful." So what's your sense of that? Do you think she's wrong? And if you don't think she's wrong, what are you doing about it, and how are you working with your members to improve that situation?
Thanks, Bill. I'm glad we're talking about non-domestic, and I know you've got a panel with Kate and others later. I've spoken to Kate, in fact, all of the panellists that you're talking to later, myself in the job, and we worked with the business groups to call for special support for the business sector when we could see that the challenges facing them were different to the challenges facing the retailers. We will continue to do that. We've also gone to our members and asked for if they've got evidence of bad practice or where they're concerned about their business customers or what they can see in their books, which we'll provide to the regulator, but also provide to people like Kate Nicholls and UK Hospitality. The non-domestic is a much more complex pitch than domestic is the short answer. And the risk to the suppliers is much bigger because of the way that we have to hedge for businesses and the risk of businesses. So to give you an example, a pub, my local pub, my local hairdresser and my kids' nursery might all have the same footprint, might all have similar energy demand, but it'll be at different times of day and they'll be very different businesses in terms of the risk posed to suppliers. So they all require different contracts and different terms. The contract terms, therefore, can look very different across a sector like Kate's to a different sector of the economy. And that often leads to businesses saying, this feels unfair, but it's often just the reality of the risk plus the cost of the energy at the moment. They're also not protected in the same way as domestic customers. Things we've done, apart from looking for evidence of bad practice, and again, it's the same message as on domestic. If there is bad practice, we're the first people to want to call that out and stamp it out. We're working with business groups on the support that they need and how quickly we can bring it in, and calling on government to take care of businesses in the way they have with retailers. We're concerned about the capacity in government on non-domestic. We think, and perhaps Jonathan will clarify, but we think there's only 2 people-ish in Ofgem working on non-domestic versus the numbers working on domestic. And then lastly, we have called for the regulation of third-party intermediaries, of which there are many in the non-domestic space. These are kind of energy consultants, brokers, etc. Just to give you a flavour, there are 1,000-ish third-party intermediaries in non-domestic. About 3/4 of small and micro businesses will get their energy contracts through TPIs rather than directly with suppliers. It's about 1/3 of the volume of contracts. And so we have said for a long time that bit of the industry needs regulating.
Okay, but at the moment, how profitable is that bit of the industry in comparison with domestic market?
It's hard to say because I'm waiting on year-end figures, which is not
What was
a
it
dodge.
last year?
I don't know off the top of my head, Ben, but I can provide to you. What I will say is they do make some profit on that sector, unlike in the retail
That
space.
would be that's where I'm going. This is my last point, Chair. It strikes me that because of the very intense, stringent, public-facing regulation on the domestic market, a lot of other things that are more profitable are happening in the non-domestic market. And I just wonder whether my intuition on that is correct. And if so, I know you said some things that you want Ofgem and the government to do, but critically, do you think that those bills are too high overall and that we need to work to get them down? Or do you think that it's, you know, the market can make things a bit easier, but ultimately they're not too high, and you think the industry is behaving appropriately?
I think there's 2 answers to that question. One is the heterogeneity of the market makes it difficult to say that across the piece, and we're cooperating with the regulator and with our own members to get kind of some sense of what's going on in the market as a whole. But I haven't seen any evidence of that so far. It's that thing about, I appreciate the instinct from folks like UK Hospitality who say, my bills are higher than this other bit of the economy, or my bills are higher than domestic households. Is this how companies are surviving? I haven't seen any evidence of that, and we have asked that question of members, and it often is the case that the bills are higher because the risk is greater in that section of the economy. UK Hospitality is struggling. If you're providing a 5-year contract and buying energy 5 years ahead and hedging for that, the reality is it's a higher risk in that bit of the economy to say one that's more stable. And again, just pulling back from this, we've seen the figures from the IMF this morning, and we have seen the figures for affordability and the cost of living crisis across the piece, and this looks like a much bigger issue for both businesses and for domestic householders, and something that is just about energy pricing.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. You win a prize for sticking to 5 minutes. Well done. Ian Lavery, please.
Thank you very much.
It's the first time for everything.
I'll be as quick as I possibly can. Ms Pinchbeck mentioned before the treatment of domestic customers by suppliers is very humane. I wonder if somebody briefly could just explain the fact that there's been more court orders. There's people dying. People cannot afford to heat in heat. There's people dying. And as Gillian mentioned before, millions of people, including vulnerable and disabled people, are being disconnected. That's the facts of the matter. and to be humane. Can somebody explain to me the reports, I think the CAB report which came out I think last month, explained about the disconnections, etc. How there's record levels of court orders being placed by suppliers, and the courts are now agreeing by the hundreds that they'll allow the suppliers to basically enter people's homes, not houses, enter their homes and do various operations within the house. Is their reports exaggerated, or are they correct?
So the reason that there are higher levels of people going onto prepayment meters is simply that there are higher levels of debt. And your point about the warrants process, that's one of the things that we're talking to the consumer groups, to Ofgem and BEIS about, to see if we can go further than the already extensive process for putting people onto a prepayment meter that exists in the supplier licence, including kind of, a cross-industry principles approach to what those steps should look like. So we are not saying that there isn't rule breaking going on or that there isn't some bad practice, but largely what this is just people cannot afford to pay their bills. The debt book is huge now facing industry. It's at a 10-year high, and so you're seeing more of the debt collecting practice come through.
And the court allows the company to enter people's homes.
Yes, that's how the warrant process works.
It's an absolute disgrace, I've got to say. People under this type of duress, and suppliers who are making fortunes are applying to the courts, and the courts are agreeing that the suppliers can enter people's homes. It's an invasion of privacy. It's an absolute outrage, I've got to say. But anyway, moving on from that, it brings into question the operations and the performance of Ofgem during the energy crisis. And I wonder if the panel could say whether they're absolutely happy or not with the performance of Ofgem during the crisis. How do you rate the performance? Could it be better? Has it been okay?
So Ofgem has carried out a number of what it calls market-wide compliance reviews, and I think as a regulator they've got a much better baseline of where the industry is at in terms of the sort of policies and processes that they have in place. I also think as a regulator they've got a much better understanding of the financial resilience of suppliers to where they were sort of in previous years. I think where we're concerned is whether they've got a good enough handle on tackling the process failures that are happening at suppliers, which is what we've seen and the problem with impacting prepayment meter customers. So we're really looking forward to this new review that they're carrying out to look much deeper than whether or not suppliers have the right processes in place, because it's how they're being implemented by staff and interpreted by staff on a day-to-day basis. Because the cases we're seeing at Citizens Advice show that there are gaps in that area, and we need better protections in place. We'd also like Ofgem to think about bringing in a new consumer duty similar to what exists in the financial services sector, to ensure that companies are required to focus on the right outcomes for their customers, because I think that will be increasingly important as we move towards the new world, where people will be required to use energy in very different ways as a result of the net zero transition. We just think we need to refresh the consumer protections to make sure that retailers always have the right focus on the right outcomes for their customers.
I would say that it's they've had a tough job. Nobody in this sector has had an easy ride, but the interests of profitability of suppliers have become more a mainstream focus for Ofgem, given the supplier failures. That has led to trade-offs, and we would continue to urge them to balance that with the interests of low-income and vulnerable consumers that they hold statutory duties for. We disagreed with the ending of the previous safeguard tariff, which was providing deeper support for vulnerable customers. And we also continue to challenge them on their approach around standing charges, and which don't currently take any account of income or a household's usage or their payment type. I think, if I may just add one final thing, I think it's right that Ofgem continue to work so closely with the UK government in terms of its response to this energy crisis. There is an affordability crisis. Government has now got the financial firepower to offer deeper support from April when we see that huge cliff edge in April with the ending of the energy bill support scheme and the increase to £3,000 of the energy price guarantee. That's going to result in households experiencing all over the country £900 increase in their energy bills when they're already at record highs, and the government, it's the UK government who's got the ability to offset that for households due to the significant savings that they're already making as a result of their the reduced cost of their current programme. So I hope that there's a balancing of the critique of energy suppliers, Ofgem's role, and the UK government's.
Okay, thank you very much. Alexander Stafford, please.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for your answer just now, Peter. That was basically answering my question I'm about to ask you anyway.
I was worried we were running out of time.
You're literally about to you preempt the question, but it's basically around there's not being a social tariff coming in until April 2024. There is these rising bills. I was going to ask you, should the government do more? How should you target it? I think Peter clearly made it that the government should do more, and you believe the government has the room to do more. Is that the opinion shared by the rest of the panel? Yes, so the government should do more. And I guess how should that extra support be targeted? Should it be targeted in the same way that the government's doing it at the moment? Should it be different? How would you see this extra support coming in? Yes,
I think there, other colleagues might come in on the need for continuing some universal support and perhaps the business case for keeping the EPG at the current level. But we do need to, in the short term, fill in the gaps in relation to those cost of living payments. We know that there's some big chasms for households, particularly those that we mentioned earlier, those that are on low incomes but aren't covered by means-tested benefits, those households with medical conditions that aren't going to be well targeted through that cost of living payments. And we need some focused attention to plug those gaps from now until April. But when we get to April 2024 and we cross over this really big concern that we've got about this coming winter, given the cost of living focused payments, we need to transition to something which is much more sustainable, either a much bigger rebate at the start of winter, or look to provide households with an enduring mechanism like a social tariff.
So Citizens Advice have been carrying a really detailed piece of work with our partners SMF, Think Tank and Public First, looking at the future need for social tariffs and the way in which support could be delivered. And we've done a lot of opinion polling, focus groups with the public, roundtables with industry, civil society, politicians, trying to build a consensus on what that social tariff should look like. We're going to be publishing the final report in the coming weeks, and we'll be happy to share a copy with the committee.
Can you give us an overview briefly now?
So the two leading options are a fixed cash discount. Now that's something that would look like the current warm home discount, but bigger and better, because the warm home discount isn't big enough in terms of the discount it offers, and it doesn't reach enough people. Or it's a percentage discount on the unit rates. Both of those options polled really well with the public, and they can be designed in a way that ensures most of the benefits accrue to low-income households. So it's really hitting those people that we want to hit with the social tariff. The one challenge, and I do think this is something we need to spend 2023 through to April 24 on, is fixing the problem of people who aren't on means-tested benefits, to ensure that it's about 3 million households, to ensure that we can get that targeted support to them automatically. So we need a new way of identifying those households, and that's probably going to involve stuff like using HMRC data, and that's something the government should be working on this year.
Yes, we're looking at. We're looking at those options, and the members are talking to consumer groups about them. I think we need to look at this in terms of timelines. So we're calling on government to keep the energy price guarantee in place so that bills stay around the £2,500 mark, and the existing support is maintained whilst we're working on options. We're looking at the idea of a social tariff, but we're also happy to consider things like expanded targeted support through things like the warm homes discount, or a separate thing. We're also looking at expanded support for energy efficiency. There's an overlap between fuel poverty, vulnerability, and some of the households we've been talking about. And then I think in the long run, we're also open to talking about market reform, and we shouldn't forget there's that at the heart of this. This is a retail market, and just to correct something that was said, the retail market does not make money on average. It's making negative margins. It is not a healthy market to do this stuff, and then we need market reform for retail. But you also need to be able to capture some of the benefits coming through of things like low-cost renewables and some of these other technologies. So I think we're also open to, like, what does that market look like and how can it benefit consumers in the long run? So 3 stages.
1 minute left.
Just briefly, on the market reform, what would the government want to do next year, or this year now? What would you want to do?
We're talking about exactly the things that Gillian and Pete have mentioned. So it's expanding the existing support schemes and then looking at things we can bring in quickly that are targeted, like a social tariff or expanded warm homes discount or similar. But we're very open to all options on the table, I think. All bright ideas welcome.
I know Peter just briefly wanted to come in, very briefly.
One of the other priorities in the short term is to levelise those payment methods. As I've already mentioned, standard credit customers are paying a huge amount more than compared to direct debit customers, so prepayment customers. We need to look at levelising those costs before it's too late.
Yeah. Thank you. Mark Pawsey, please.
Thank you, Chair. I want to stick with the social tariff because clearly one of the challenges we've got is identifying those who are in need and require support. And both Emma and Peter did speak about the use of smart meters in this regard. I'm just wondering if we can tease that out a little bit more. Exactly how, I mean, the government doesn't have a brilliant record in the rollout of smart meters, and in the present climate, it seems to have been parked on one side while we support people through these difficulties. But just tell us a little bit more about how the use of smart meters could help identify those people who would benefit from the application of a social tariff. Perhaps Peter first.
Yeah, thank you. And they're already benefiting suppliers that have customers that are on prepayment, smart prepayment meters are able to look at them when they're regularly self-disconnecting. They're also able to actively monitor in real time the amount of VENs that those households are putting on. Often where there's loose change associated with a particular VEN, say it's £4.19, for example, that indicates that a household is maxed out and that they're just trying to put as much on as possible. And by looking at those trends, you can identify not just those households that are already self-disconnecting, but proactively offer
So we're
support.
talking purely about prepayment customers.
I
was wondering about the broader realm of customers, maybe those who pay by more conventional means. Emma, how?
I mean, it's the same functionality that Pete's describing, but applied to customers as a whole. So I don't know if any of you participated in the great big energy turn down over the last week, where we got householders to turn down their supply. But I have a smart meter. If you've got one and you're doing that, so you're turning off your lights or you're shifting when you're cooking, you can see the kilowatts in your house drop off. Now, you can see that as a householder on your in-home display, but we can also see that as an industry, and we can use it. So if we know what people use on average, we can help them do things like load shifting, so moving around when they use energy, which makes the grid more efficient and saves money as a whole. So we think it's about £16 billion benefit back to the energy system and being more flexible like this. And then for things like vulnerability, that point I made at the beginning, the households now falling into what we would deem vulnerable or struggling to pay their bills are not households that we have traditionally classed as vulnerable. So it enables us to see people who would never think of themselves in that way, who are shifting their behaviour with their energy or at risk of self-disconnection and all of those things, and get in early or add them to priority customer services.
This is essentially looking at patterns of behaviour.
Yeah.
Are there any unforeseen consequences? Is there a danger that somebody's pattern of usage might change for a perfectly valid reason, and it's not one that indicates a financial difficulty?
As Pete says, people go to hospital or go on holiday or those things. So yes, but you can easily fix that by having that then communication with your customer. It's worth saying with things like warrants and forced installs or PPMs, it is required that there's been a long process of communication. So you might see that someone is changing their behaviour on their smart meter, or they might contact you with a concern about paying their bill. And then it is required that there is a very long process of talking to that customer about what help they could access, what more could be done for them. Where there are warrants issued or you get to the kind of point of forced installation, it's at a point where it's people who won't pay or you haven't been able to communicate with them at all. So one of the good things about smart meters, you can see the data to start that conversation early. You can start offering interesting tariffs and services back to your customers. We can save money for the grid because it's critical infrastructure. And we can facilitate those conversations about energy use and concerns about vulnerability for some of the kinds of households we've been talking about who've never previously been vulnerable.
And Peter, you said that a social tariff would need to sit alongside the energy price cap. If the social tariff is dealing with those vulnerable customers, why can't we leave the market to provide the right price level for the remainder of customers? Why would we need both?
I don't know if it would be retained in exactly the same format, but one of the main functions of the wider price cap at the moment is the regulation of policy costs through to bills. There was a big uncertainty previously about the extent to which policy costs were driving up bills, and that led to great distrust in some instances around the green economy and the transition to net zero.
Transparency by EMA's members deal with that if people knew exactly what they were paying on these other components of the bill?
Potentially, but I'd use all your armoury to try and make sure that there is transparency around that area, and it's a good news story for the UK government at the moment on that front.
Gillian.
So the price cap was originally put in place to address the loyalty penalty, which was people who didn't switch
suppliers. But it's not doing that, is it?
I think we're now in such a unique situation where we don't have competitive tariffs. There is no competition happening in the energy market at the moment.
That's because the price is
no, it's been put on life support for the moment.
There's no competition in a market where somebody dictates the price.
Absolutely. We used to have the coexistence of the price cap and competition in the market, but following the start of the energy price crisis and all the supplier failures, that has now disappeared. And I think there's a question about what the new world will look like. And this is, I'm sure, something that Jonathan
Does the new
from
world
Ofgem,
need a price cap in addition to an effective social tariff?
I think it might. It might. There's various options. I think we definitely need a social tariff in the new world. And it should be a social tariff that doesn't take people out of the market, so ensures that they can still benefit from all the innovation that will be happening, because we very much want low-income and vulnerable households to be able to participate and benefit from that innovation if they're able to do so.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much. Alan Brown, please.
Thanks, Chair. Peter, if start with you, if that's okay. So if we take figures from National Energy Action, it's predicted 8.4 million households are in fuel poverty come April, which is roughly a third of all households. So if we're looking at energy efficiency installations, is there a greater need now to focus on a wider range of households to help in order to reduce demand, energy demand overall, which long term that obviously helps all bill payers, or is there still a need to focus on those in the greatest financial need? And on that latter point, is there any concern about Eco Plus only having a 20% focus on low-income households?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I think it's true that any household that's living in an energy inefficient home will feel the price point much more keenly. So a typical £3,000 energy bill in April will feel much more like £4,500, £5,000 for those households living in the least efficient homes. But we do need to continue to make progress on our statutory fuel poverty commitments. It's written into law that we should tackle this vicious overlap between the households that live on the lowest incomes and also inhabit the least efficient homes. There's about 3 million in England alone that live in properties below Band C. In a very helpful way, I think Chris Skidmore the other day in his report set out not just the moral case, but the economic case for doing that. So if we help those households through energy efficiency measures, it doesn't only help the environment, but it also returns money much more quickly back to local economies and has a better sort of multiplier effect if you focus on low income and vulnerable homes, as well as the huge health benefits. So I think there are good reasons to continue with the focus, particularly where those policies that are funding energy efficiency improvements are levy funded. It would be particularly galling to see a disproportionate focus on affluent households who theoretically could pay for some of that investment in energy efficiency themselves if it's being subsidised by poorer households that need those measures the most.
Okay, thanks. Emma, can I ask you, and just in terms of energy efficiency rollout, sometimes talk about doing a street-by-street, area-by-area approach. Is there enough done on that? Because it seems to me there's actually then contractual efficiencies. If you set up an area, a contractor sets up a compound, you bring in the materials, welfare facilities, you've got a base rather than a kind of more ad hoc approach. Is there enough done in targeting key areas, or is there scope for much greater efficiency and then greater installs?
I think we could do a whole evidence session on energy efficiency rollout, which is, as Peter said, we'd be fans. We used to work together on energy efficiency a long time ago. And the reason we think it's valuable is it's about, I think it's £3 or £4 back to the Exchequer for every £1 spent on energy efficiency because of saving money on bills and in the wider economy. The thing that's worked with energy efficiency rollout to date has been that the suppliers have done it. So you kind of get that scale that you're talking about, and we have targeted vulnerable households and the most in need. There is a very live debate going on, led actually by the industry about expanding ECO to help more households. We've put in a request for that support into the Chancellor for the Spring Statement. Then is a longer term conversation about how you get the kind of economy-wide energy efficiency gains you're talking about, and whether it's street by street or another approach. I think we'd be all up for that longer term conversation. For now, as with all of this, I think what we're saying is you've got to bank what works in a crisis and do as much of it as possible. So we're talking about expanding the existing eco scheme rather than kind of tearing up paperwork and doing something new. That doesn't mean that there isn't room for how do you help the able to pay market do this, how do you get it going through communities, what's the role of local authorities. But that, Darren, could be the subject of a whole other inquiry, I think.
Right. And on that, is there enough being done in terms of the private renting sector? Because basically the UK government is supposed to come back and implement targets for that, but that's still outstanding. So, Peter?
It's a massive concern. I think it's been over 5 years since the government initially mooted it in the Clean Growth Strategy, further 2 years since they had a very detailed consultation in terms of improving and extending those requirements in the private rented sector. Huge amount of uncertainty for tenants as a result, and a huge amount of needless energy expenditure during what has been a cost of living crisis. So there's huge consequences to the delay of setting out what those targets should be. There's also now a link between those private rented sector standards and the standards that we should expect of social landlords, and that hiatus is inexcusable, particularly in the context of trying to meet our fuel poverty commitments, given how many households are in the private rented sector and also live in fuel poverty.
Okay, sir, can I just jump back to Eco Plus for you, Peter? So if you take 80% of the programmes out with the 20% low-income households, customers are expected to pay 10% towards install costs. Is it worth keeping that 10% billing in place, or are too many households going to miss out, given what it said that a third of households are in fuel poverty?
I think capital, sort of hardwiring capital contributions into the scheme precludes almost deliberately the contribution of the poorest household. So it's a really poor policy decision in our view. I think the only area that it could be justified is if the Eco Plus scheme is going to be across 10 years, requiring an even higher capital contribution from the landlord is absolutely the right thing to do. That can make the jam go a little bit further.
Okay, thank you. I'm so sorry to keep everybody moving on a very important subject, but we have another two panels, so thank you to all three of you for your contributions this morning. We're now moving on to our second panel, where we'll be talking about non-domestic customers, so businesses, public services and others. And we're welcoming Tina McKenzie, the National Vice Chair and Chair of Policy and Advocacy for the Federation of Small Businesses, Stephen Phipson, who's the Chief Executive for MEEC UK, and Kate Nicholls, the Chief Executive of UK Hospitality.
That's my bill at home. That's my bill at our house. And they're offering me for me sandwiches.
Thank you, and good morning to all of you. So just to kick us off, it would be useful to get your individual perspectives, specifically the implications of high energy bills for businesses and what you're seeing in terms of companies going bust as a consequence of having to make different decisions, and if at all possible trying to distinguish that from other economic factors, if that is at all possible, just so we can try to really focus in on the energy aspects. Kate Nicholls first, please.
Well, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for inviting me here today to give evidence to you. I think it is incredibly difficult to separate out those energy challenges from the wider economic challenges that we've got across the hospitality sector, but I will do my very best to do so because I think there is some emerging evidence of what you're seeing. Obviously, we're facing into quite a perfect storm You've got long economic COVID affecting the sector with high debt levels. You've had no real time for recovery to be building back cash reserves, and you've got half of our members saying they have no cash reserves and a third of them that are still not trading profitably over the course of this year. So it is quite difficult to dissociate. What we have seen, however, is a marked change in the role that energy plays in the business model for hospitality and the increasing significance in terms of business viability going forward. So pre-pandemic, if you looked across the hospitality sector at an individual outlet level, energy costs were typically around 4 to 6% of turnover, higher in some of those high energy usage, particularly around hotels. They've now become 15 to 17% of turnover at an outlet level. It's gone from being the fourth largest cost centre to the second, more than rent and rates combined, and the only bigger cost that you've got before you open your doors is your staffing. And that's why it's become such a big, significant factor in business viability decisions, in seeing whether you're a going concern. Because before you meet any of your other costs, you've got to meet those high energy bills and be able to cover them, and know that when you open on a Monday, a wet Monday in January in the northeast where I come from, you've got to be able to cover roughly about £800 to £900 before you turn a penny profit to make the decision as to whether it's worth opening. What we have therefore seen is quite a different trend over the course of the last year in business failures in the sector. We had a contraction of about 6% across the sector as a whole. 5,000 businesses closed for good over the course of 2022. And about 3/4 of them were in the last quarter of the year. That's highly unusual. We normally have our business failures coming at the start of the year, not in the third and fourth quarter. People usually hang on to trade their way through Christmas and get some cash in the tank. We're not seeing that, and as I say, 3/4 of those business failures were happening September, October, November, December, and one of the largest factors that was talked about in those business failures, particularly amongst the independents, was energy costs. They just weren't able to manage to cover those costs and remain sustainable and viable. So the inflationary environment, the cost of doing business, yes, that is all a factor. The discretionary spend downturn, the rail and travel disruption, we are facing into that perfect storm, but energy is a more significant factor in business failure in our sector than it has ever been in the 30 years I've worked in the industry.
Thank you. Stephen Phipson.
Same issues really, Chair. I think in terms of disaggregating the challenges that manufacturers have got in terms of labour costs and supply chain disruption and everything else. However, we have done a lot of work with manufacturers around the energy cost itself, which has gone up in our surveys as a top priority for many manufacturers in terms of risking their businesses going forwards. I like to use the example of a machine shop producing parts for the aerospace industry. Just before we introduced the LBS, their annual cost of electricity was around £160,000 a year, and it was rising to £1.1 million a year. The challenge for those kinds of SME manufacturers is they're often locked into 2-year or 3-year pricing arrangements with prime contractors. No chance of passing that on whatsoever. So the fact we brought in the EBRS at that stage was very welcome to those kinds of companies. But it shows you really the long-term nature of the pricing arrangements and the inability of those companies to increase prices. We see that replicated across the sector. I think the other thing I would point out, and you're probably going to ask this later on in the session, Chair, is the behaviour of energy suppliers in the industrial sector for these sorts of smaller companies has been very variable and very difficult. We're now seeing in a phase where companies are being asked for £100,000 security deposits up front to switch contracts. And the wholesale price that we talk about, the schemes that the government has, often not filtering through in terms of those discounts to those suppliers. So we welcome the Chancellor's comments about bringing Ofgem in to regulate the industrial sector. That's important. But on top of everything else, that's something these companies do not need. So it's been quite tough. In terms of specifics, right now, we estimate from our survey data that around 13% of manufacturers in this country are operating on break-even and without cash reserves with the current level of energy support. And with withdrawing that, or that becomes worse, that's going to tip them over the edge. So that's the group that's most at risk in our sector out of a community of around 250,000 manufacturers in the country.
Thank you. Tina McKenzie, I mean, where does a business get the cash flow from? If they've already taken on debt in the pandemic, they've got no cash reserves, these costs are coming through the doors. I mean, where do they go?
Well, they've limited choices to where they go, but I think it's important to say that the IMF figures are out today, and they show that the UK has got a contraction. We were looking at hopefully a small increase, but across G7 we're the only country with a 0.6% contraction. Everyone else is due to grow. And interestingly, that 99% of the businesses in the UK are SMEs. We know that it was sitting at 5.9 million in 2020 going into COVID. We know for a fact it then dropped over those 12 months to 5.5 million. So we've already lost hundreds of thousands of SMEs in the country, and we haven't yet been given the absolute figures of the last 12 months, but we do think the introduction of the EBRS certainly saved a lot of businesses up and down the country. In terms of where they go, they've got few choices. We've seen from the ONS stats that actually cash reserves are down to some of their lowest levels because of all the other things those businesses are facing. But actually they can increase prices, and our survey shows that a percentage of businesses are looking to do that. They can't push all of that into a price increase, so others are looking to close down or to change their businesses or indeed to go offshore.
Right. Thank you very much. Alan Brown, please.
Thanks, Chair. For start with yourself, Tina, so the Chancellor's brought in the energy bill discount scheme from April, and he said that would stop businesses facing a cliff edge that provides a transition. But the reality is it's 0.7p discount per unit of gas, 0.2p unit of electricity discount, and the FSB described these levels of support is totally insignificant for small businesses. So what does that support look like for a typical small business, and what's the effect? Does it remove the cliff edge or not this April for small businesses?
No, it's absolutely pitiful, and we were clear about that in our messaging, and clear about that to government as well. Unfortunately, a lot of businesses tied into fixed prices over the period of, let's say, August, September last year, and so they were tying into prices usually around 75, 80 pence, which if you had the fixed support from the government, then it wasn't an issue because the price per kilowatt was capped. Now that that's taken away and we have a few pennies over 30p that will be discounted, if you're sitting in a contract you can't get out of for the next 2 years at 75, 80 pence, then quite quickly that couple of pennies over 30p on a discount isn't really going to do much at all to help you. And that's the point where a lot of businesses actually still haven't even realised what's about to hit them with those bills that are coming in April, May, June, and we're quite worried about that cliff edge when those bills hit, what's going to happen. Now, we do know that wholesale prices have gone down, and that's something that people have said, well, is there anything to worry about if the wholesale prices have gone down? But yes, on the one hand, we have these people fixed into these really high contracted prices, but on the other hand, looking around the world at the moment with the geopolitical situation we've got, we feel like we're maybe gambling a little bit early on stability and low wholesale prices, and that's what we're quite concerned about. Any other global move and there's several things going on around the world, could absolutely affect that wholesale price, and businesses are in real trouble again.
Okay, so what reforms, if any, to the energy bills discount scheme would you like to see, given what you've said that it's pitiful at the moment? So what reforms would you like to see?
We would have liked to have seen the government ring fence and help the most vulnerable of businesses, and that is the smallest micro businesses, which in a sense are like domestic users, and domestic users are still protected, domestic consumers. So some of those micro businesses that are so vulnerable and have no cash reserves, we would have liked them to have given them a bit more of a landing zone, a bit more time. We as a country have spent billions supporting businesses to stay open through COVID. And it would be just, it doesn't make sound economic sense to let them go and disappear now with energy prices and with them being tied into such high price contracts. So for us, it's not good economics. It doesn't make sense. If we'd have ring fenced some of the smallest, most vulnerable businesses, and they are, by the way, in the country, some of the businesses that are actually high energy users, like your pubs, sunbed shops and butcher shops, and the list goes on. Some of our smallest businesses that are so important to the local communities use a lot of energy.
Do your members echo the thoughts that Tina just shared there?
absolutely. I think you had, from our members, around 3/4 of them were renewing energy contracts ahead of October, so they were locking in to try and get a contract. They were having to pay very high security deposits, as Stephen has said, in order to just secure a contract, not even to look at changing, but just to secure a contract. And so you've got lots of businesses that are locked in at very high rates, that were locked in over the summer, who, when they come out of contract or when we move away from the support, they're not going to see it drop as significantly in terms of price. And then on top of that, over and above the sort of level of commodity price, which is regulated, you've got non-commodity charges, which are making up an increasing part of the bill, and meaning that customers are still facing a significant high retail charge for them. So we're estimating that for our members across the board, the average price increase is going to be around 85% when we come out of support in April, because of the level of the cap that Tina's talked about and the very low level of support. And then you've still got members who are still facing 150, 200% increases in price as we go through that. So we're not seeing the suppliers passing on the drop in wholesale price, and we're also seeing large numbers of members who are contracted in and are not coming up for renewal for quite a period of time.
Okay, so after spending 18 billion in the Energy Bills Relief Scheme, is basically the government just paying that money to stay, like, just delaying the inevitable collapse of some businesses unless there's massive reform?
Well, the scheme that was put in place undoubtedly saved many thousands of jobs and businesses in our sector that would have otherwise gone to the wall because of the situation we were facing with energy. And it's energy that is the game changer in our sector. We're a viable, vibrant sector of the economy. We're the third largest employer. We generate a revenue of around 130 billion and a 40 billion pound tax take for the Exchequer. So we're a hugely important part of the economy. And when we fire on all cylinders, the economy starts to grow and we recover. So it's undoubtedly the case that scheme was vital to get businesses through. I think the cliff edge has been shaved off slightly and the sort of drop has been filled in, but for many businesses they will still see a significant increase in costs because of the introduction of a cap and the very low level of support that we're seeing from April. So we would have preferred to see the approach that was previously being talked about, where vulnerable sectors and hospitality was name-checked by the Chancellor, the Business Secretary and the Prime Minister previously as being vulnerable and needing more support. We would have liked to see additional support to hospitality from April.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Mark Causey, please.
Thank you, Chair. I want to focus on the treatment of businesses by energy suppliers and start off with Kate, if I may. You were very critical and pointed out there are some rogue companies, and I think that was acknowledged by Emma Pinchbeck in her earlier evidence session that there are one or two companies who haven't behaved as they might have done. But can you just give us a sense of how extensive this problem is and experiences of any of your members?
The situation that we've got with hospitality is very few energy suppliers will contract with hospitality. They treat the sector as a whole as being at risk rather than looking at individual companies. So there is a sort of blanket risk premium. So we do find, therefore, that any problems that emerge are magnified because you've got a smaller number of suppliers, typically three or four.
A hospitality unit sees their contract coming to an end, they pick up the phone and ring up half a dozen suppliers, and you're saying that how many out of half a dozen would say, sorry, we're not willing to supply your sector?
Usually about four. You've got three or four main suppliers that supply the sector. You've got a general unwillingness to let people move contracts. You've got higher charges that are being applied for security deposits and risk premiums that are applied if you want to try and switch. So switching is very difficult, so competition doesn't exist. What we then noticed over the course of the last year, in the first half of the year, we saw very high security deposits being attached to get a supply. And contract terms being applied. But then once the government regulated the wholesale price and the commodity price, we then saw significant changes in practice where there was an acceleration of increases in service charges, access charges and non-commodity charges. So you were seeing 500 to 600% increases put through on standing charges. That meant that the bill was significantly higher. So those are the kind of practices we've seen. We've also seen quite a few companies not be able to pass on that discount that the government scheme is providing, including some very big providers in the sector saying they can't apply the discount to bills until January because their systems don't allow them to do it. These are vulnerable businesses that need support straight away, and some of the biggest energy suppliers are not passing it through.
Those examples that you've given us, are they common, or are there some good guys amongst all of this?
There are some very good guys amongst all of this. There are those that have seen, recognised that security deposits don't need to be 6 months. of energy supply, which inevitably is a higher charge. There are many that have kept prices
What is
low.
your organisation doing to pass on details to your members of the companies that are reputable and worth dealing with in this sector, and those that perhaps they should avoid?
We have regular seminars with our members and webinars. We've had liaisons with Energy UK and Ofgem to be able to identify what is a good and bad practice and to provide that information and advice and guidance to our members to direct them in their negotiations and contract discussions. But inevitably, although we represent large companies as well, there is an imbalance of power if you are a single site, independent pub, bar, restaurant, hotel, talking to an energy supplier. Sometimes, even with the best of endeavours from UK hospitality, we can't get traction on that.
And Stephen, you first drew our attention to these security deposits, but let me put it to you that if one of your manufacturing members was supplying a sector that was emerging and pretty risky, they might want some form of deposit from their customer before proceeding with a bespoke manufactured product. So what's unreasonable about an energy company saying, you know, some of these businesses are liable to fail. If they fail, we will end up with a bad debt. So we can insure ourselves against that by asking for a deposit. Why shouldn't they do that?
And you're right to draw the attention to the insurance element, which comes out very strongly when we're talking about why they are actually requesting these security deposits in the first place. I think it's a change in behaviour. I think one of the things we're doing as an organisation is trying to help companies, particularly smaller companies who don't normally have to do a financial presentation to their energy company about the financial robustness of their organisation to try to encourage them to give them an energy contract. That sort of process is new. So right or wrongs aside for a second.
The accounts the energy company can look at are usually a year or two out of date, aren't they? So is it unreasonable for an energy company to say, look, if you provide me with evidence that your business is secure, I'm happy to forego the security deposit that I might need from another company?
It's probably entirely reasonable. However, what we're finding is the majority of energy companies are then not proceeding to offer a contract. It's too risky, it's too difficult. We need a bigger deposit if we're going to do that, which leaves a lot of these companies struggling for where they're going to get those energy contracts in the future. That's becoming a real problem.
Okay, so what's the solution?
The solution is regulation. The solution is Ofgem should be, and I think the Chancellor is doing this, to be fair, and he's called for this consultation, or not so much a consultation, but I think an inquiry of Ofgem as to how they might intervene in the industrial energy market to make sure that there is a level playing field here, so we all understand what the rules are going forward. I think that would help enormously.
And Tina, I think FSP said that 2023 is looking like the beginning of the end for thousands of small businesses. Isn't that a bit dramatic?
Definitely not. When you look at what happened.
Thousands of businesses.
Absolutely.
And these are innovative entrepreneurs, and you're telling me they're not able to adapt.
Okay, would you like me to give you some examples of what some of these businesses are facing? I've got a whole pack of examples where businesses are going up from where they were maybe standing at an annual charge on their energy of around 2,000 to 3,000, going up to 60, 70, 80,000. And when you imagine a lot of these are SMEs who were running on maybe profits of 20, 30, 40,000, you can automatically see they become unviable. I think we've written to the energy suppliers, and I agree with what the others have said about the standing charges. And, if we were in a normal market scenario, then you know what? The market plays out, and small businesses and the FSB are very into normal market conditions and the market playing out. But we're not in that environment. And when we get into a tricky situation where the prices went astronomical and they were completely abnormal because of the war, then that's where let me just finish quickly, that's where we saw these deposits and caps increase significantly, and that's where we feel like some suppliers took advantage of a situation the country was facing, and that was unfair.
Yeah, so what do we need for a normal market scenario in your view?
Well, I think we need to go back to what the barriers to entry are for organisations becoming energy suppliers in this country.
We did that, and we had loads of people. We had one giving evidence to us here who started a business out of his front room and went bust, and the government had to step in to support the people who were customers of that business. So we've got to be a bit careful, haven't we?
You know, so the first thing is you don't want to stave entrepreneurs. We are a country of entrepreneurs. We want to give people an open opportunity. But at the same time, when you're speaking of something so important as energy, and there are many other industries like it, where it is the heartbeat not just for consumers but of our businesses across the UK, then we need to ensure that those businesses going in there have their own healthy cash reserves, but also are living by rules that if the country gets into a situation where our energy is really significantly reduced and under such risk, that they do not continue and take advantage as you would maybe in a normal market scenario. That is not too much to ask for, and that's in fact why we have a government, in order to ensure that when we get into these situations that we protect the most vulnerable and we don't drive our economy off a cliff. That's really important.
And are you agreeing with Stephen that there's a role here for Ofgem?
Absolutely, and we've been speaking to Ofgem about it, and we would like to see Ofgem, with the consultation, Ofgem have more teeth with this and have more time and energy to spend on it, more resources, and I think that would absolutely help the sector for the future if we get into one of these scenarios again. Also, another thing that's going to help here is if we encourage, and we are encouraging the government with help to green schemes, so that businesses and consumers are not so reliant on the increases and decreases, the volatility of the normal markets, that we can put people onto some of the green schemes and actually they can be self-sufficient in their energy and we're not dictated to by actions such as Russia in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Ruth Edwards, please.
Thank you, Chair. I should probably just declare that I have had the pleasure of working with Stephen in one of his formal roles, and I also know Kate outside of the committee. Just to carry on the theme of Ofgem, how you've talked about what you'd like Ofgem to do in the future. How would you rate Ofgem's performance in protecting non-domestic customers, your members, throughout the sort of energy crisis to date? Kate, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you. I mean, we have worked with Ofgem over the course of the crisis. We first flagged that this was an issue. We tend to be the canary in the coal mine because of the experiences of our members that we have. But we first flagged this as an issue with government and with Ofgem in February last year. So this has been an escalating crisis. And I think the only criticism I would make is pace and scale and sense of urgency. And I think echo some points that were made on the previous panel, that the focus has undoubtedly been on domestic customers and that this sector has sort of been a bit of a Cinderella and not had the same attention and scope. So we have been flagging these issues with Ofgem. Ofgem has used their convening power to gather groups of suppliers together to try and address common concerns, but it has been quite difficult to get acceptance and traction that there are issues here that need to be looked at as we've gone through the crisis. So I think, when the government started to hold Ofgem's feet to the fire and Ofgem then held suppliers' feet to the fire in November, that was when we started to see a marked and material difference and a willingness to engage in constructive dialogue about how we could solve these problems together. I think prior to that, there was an element of denial going on amongst energy suppliers that there was a real issue that businesses were facing.
Mm-hmm. And what progress have you seen since November?
We've seen quite rapid progress. There's been several meetings. There's been evidence gathering both from the businesses that are affected who are frustrated at some of the terms that are being imposed, because it is right and proper that we make sure we've got a valid evidence base, and gathering evidence from the suppliers to look at where the real issues of priority are, and then Ofgem has been able to drill down on those issues, to particularly around deemed pricing, where people are on variable daily rates which were exceptionally high, non-commodity charges and security deposits that are escalating the price and inflating the price that people are paying for energy bills. So we've been quite heartened by the progress since November, and we've had several positive meetings with ministers and with Ofgem over the last couple of weeks.
Thank you. Stephen, what's your experience been?
I think, to be fair to Ofgem, they haven't really had the remit to look at the industrial energy sector. That's not been their area of focus in terms of regulation. So the resources devoted inside of Ofgem to this have been very, very small. So good conversations, but not much resource, hence welcoming the Chancellor's intervention recently. They have, of course, on the non-commodity charges, been that is highly regulated across the piece. So that element, the 8 to 12% of your energy bill that's the non-commodity prices, is regulated by Ofgem, but the rest of it isn't. And what we're asking for here is to broaden their remit, to give them that responsibility to bring that in. And I think that's exactly where the Chancellor's asked the question, but that's going to mean more resources for Ofgem, I think, to do this job properly.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. And now we've obviously heard from Energy UK in the previous panel. Their view is that Ofgem doesn't have the resources or the sort of expertise to enforce their existing regulatory role properly. Is that something you would agree with? Or is that...
Well, certainly, I'm not so sure on the consumer side, because that's not my area of expertise, but certainly on the industrial energy side, they're going to need to stand up a proper team to do this properly, and we need to do that properly quite quickly.
Thank you. Tina, what's the FSB's view?
Yeah, I think it comes back to, it's twofold. It isn't just about Ofgem, it's also about the energy companies themselves in terms of who are allowed to enter, on what basis, what reserves they have, what rules they're under, but also in Ofgem in terms of looking to police that and have some power with that. Certainly more resources is needed, more expertise, more finance and a bigger scope, and it's going to take some time, I think, to get that right. The good news is We are now in a period where the prices are lower. We have maybe a window of opportunity. I hope that the prices, we don't have another shock in the market and the prices don't go up quite significantly over a short period of time. But whilst we have these dropping prices, this is the perfect time to get into Ofgem and get it right.
Thank you. And just one quick follow-up on your comments earlier. You mentioned that the government should be looking to ring-fence the smallest and help the smallest businesses. How would you advise that we can best identify those businesses who needed the most help?
We've given a few examples of how they can do that. Something simple is those businesses that use less than a certain amount of hours in energy per year, and that you can identify quite quickly. They're the micro businesses. There's lots of different ways to identify it. And actually we feel like it wouldn't cost the government a lot of money. What it will do is stop energy firms taking advantage of those smallest businesses who really don't know when they're quoted a contract of 75, 85p a pound per hour. They really don't know sometimes what they're signing up to.
And what's your view on what the cost would be? Does the FSB have any idea of the scale?
And we've done some costings which we can forward to the committee. We've done some costings on various different scenarios depending on how you define it.
Thank you. And Stephen, one final question to you. It's obviously not a substitute for reform of the energy market, but we have seen in Germany a number of manufacturing businesses save a huge amount of money on energy costs by rethinking their processes. Are any of your members doing that? What sort of conversations are going on with firms who are making breakthroughs here to spread that best practice?
So manufacturing sector in this country is an extremely innovative sector. So on our current surveys, 39% of manufacturers in the country are investigating or starting to invest in alternative sources of energy, and certainly on the efficiency side of their processes, that's important. Brings up another point about support and encouragement from government. I mean, the long term isn't subsidy for energy costs for industrial. The long term is reform of the energy market and its investment in more efficient processes. So I think the Energy Transformation Fund, for example, comes to an end in 2 weeks' time. We haven't got anything to replace those funds, those incentives after this. And one of the calls we've had with Treasury is, what are we going to do now? Because we should be encouraging these businesses to look at a lot more of these alternative investments to get them off the dependency of high energy costs. That's really, really important. So we'd welcome that. Some of that can be done on their own, but for the smaller businesses, for the SMEs in the manufacturing sector, they're going to need some help. And that help comes in the form of either funds, like the Energy Transformation Fund, which was rather complex to access, but that's a whole other subject, or it comes in terms of tax incentives and investment in those green technologies. So that's a real push for us at the moment with Treasury.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andy McDonald.
Thanks, Chair. Just keeping on the theme of energy-intensive industries, I mean, there isn't much alternative available to them today. So I'm just wanting you to inform us about their competitiveness. I'm thinking of steel, ceramics, chemical and process industries. If they go, we might be in trouble, and the SMEs that flow therefrom will also be in trouble. So are you seeing that impact in terms of competitiveness now?
We are indeed. So the situation on energy intensives, there's 2 points really. On the EBDS scheme, the new scheme that's coming out post-April, the definition of trade intensity and energy intensity is done by SIC code, basically, if you look at the way that they've arranged this, which means it goes in your primary SIC code. So there's a lot of companies that are energy-intensive companies, car companies that make batteries and have foundries on site, which are not now going to be included in the new scheme because their primary SIC code doesn't allow them to be in that category, and that applies throughout industry. So we see a calculation of a reduction of about 10% of businesses that we would have considered energy intensives to be able to qualify for EBDS. That's one of the challenges of that scheme. On your point about competitiveness, it remains the case. If we look at what's happening in places like Spain and Portugal, where they have now decoupled gas prices from electricity prices, they've taken out network charges from industrial bills, it means that the difference in the new scheme going forwards is about 60% difference in terms of our prices being more expensive for those energy. And even with a generous 30% discount and everything else, we remain highly uncompetitive compared to a lot of the European countries. That means switching production. That means for things like steel, we're talking about global commodity prices here. Very often some of those plants have got sister plants in European or other countries, and what we have seen is them taking decisions about whether to operate that day or not, depending on the spot price of electricity. that will continue. And as the disparity between us and Europe grows going forwards, that will become more of a risk to our own foundation industries, which are absolutely critical to industrialisation.
And so given that we're the highest out of 24 countries in terms of our energy prices, are you seeing that realisation of people saying we've
There's daily
got the ability
decisions
to
being
switch?
taken in those plants about whether to operate or not, depending on today's spot price, compared to their sister organisation where they could transfer production.
Yeah. So I'm going to wrap up with this, Chair, but is that the case that we see Liberty Steel? I mean, they've cited high energy costs leading to 440 redundancies there. Are you seeing signs that that's going to happen? And if so, which are the sectors that are most concerning to you?
Steel is number one for me. I mean, if we look at that, that's absolutely, I mean, they're all vital. Chemical, we're seeing the same things in chemical industries at the moment as well. But as you can imagine, in fact, some of the chemical plants aren't now included in the EBDS because of this SIC code issue, but that's a technicality. But it's the comparison between what's going on in Europe, if you look at the way that they're handling their energy crisis, compared to the prices going
surely
forward.
the chemical and process industries are the ones that are most agile. They've got the ability to go to Holland and Germany
they have.
very, very quickly.
Exactly, and they will do. That's the problem, rather than keeping it here.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Just one very quick follow-up. So I heard the evidence around businesses changing their processes or their energy use to reduce their energy consumption needs. For businesses, though, that are in offices or pubs or hotels, are we seeing landlords come forward with investment to improve energy efficiency in those settings or not?
We are to an extent. It depends on the type of landlord in our sector. If you've got commercial landlords and you're on the high street, they are not coming forward in the same way. You are seeing that from some of the pub industry, pub company owning landlords where they're doing refurbishments and doing co-investment in kitchen technology in particular. It's undoubtedly the case, though, that where you're looking at that investment in green technology or you're doing a refurbishment of a site, which would typically take place every 7 years, the energy efficient induction hobs, lighting, etc., are more expensive than the non-green alternative. And so Stephen's absolutely right. Looking at some of those tax incentives, looking again at the definition of an R&D tax credit, looking at the capital allowances for our sector, capital allowances, you have to make a profit to benefit from a capital allowance. So you can have a capital allowance and it's not getting you anywhere. So bringing forward some more innovative schemes to allow people to make the investment in more expensive technology and kit when they're doing a kitchen refurb would be undoubtedly beneficial. But we are going to need to change the definition of the R&D tax credit and look again at how it's done. And this Skidmore report identifies some of the moonshot approaches that have been taken where that is offset against pre-profit taxes rather than post-profit taxes, which is our scope.
Anything final to add on that, Tina, before we move
just
on?
to say that a lot of our members are small commercial landlords, and due to the uncertainty in the market, they're not investing in their premises, and we're not seeing that in terms of energy. And that is for a number of reasons. It's the uncertainty in the market, the lack of availability of cash, the fact that a lot of people have actually got more loans and carrying more debt than ever before, and also a lack of availability of information about what's available out there. Certain parts of the country have got good suppliers in terms of going in and delivering some green efficient energy solutions. Other parts of the country don't. And I'm particularly thinking of some of those rural towns that are really being impacted. We've also got a lot of high streets. Go up and down your high streets if you're in a small town, and you'll see a lot of commercial premises are simply now just empty. And so therefore, we're not seeing a huge investment from those landlords. We think something has to be done to kickstart it.
Chair, can I just add, one of our members' survey did show as well that a large proportion of our members who were wanting to make energy investments in energy efficiencies, 80% of them looking to do so, their working capital was predominantly tied up in energy security deposits sitting with their energy suppliers. So their ability to do that, there's millions of pounds that is just dead capital sitting in security deposits.
An interesting thought to finish that panel. Thank you to all three of you for your contributions, as ever. We're very grateful. We're now going to move on to the final panel, and we're going to be welcoming to the top table Jonathan Brearley, the Chief Executive of Ofgem, who I think might have just run to the loo, so hopefully bad timing. And Neil Kenwood, Director of Strategy and Interim Director of Markets for Ofgem, and Neil Lawrence, the Director of Retail for Ofgem. So we'll just change over the names and cups.
Brilliant. Timing's terrific, isn't it?
Okay, just as we're waiting for Jonathan to get back into the room, if I could just pick up some of the issues that came up in our previous panel. Jonathan, hi. So I was just going to raise some of the issues that came up in the previous panels, particularly some of the comments from Energy UK, which I thought were interesting. I mean, the trade body for the energy companies is basically saying some of them aren't following the rules and you should tell them off more, but shouldn't they just be following the rules in the first place?
So, Chair, as you know, we wanted to give a kind of broader overview of the market, but just to focus on that for a moment, I am deeply concerned by the comments that came from Energy UK today. So there is a good debate about whether we should enforce more and how we run our compliance processes, and we will have those today. But the idea that the industry say the way we obey the rules is by making the regulator enforce more shows to me a deep problem with the culture and the approach that some in the industry are taking. Now, quite frankly, I don't think that represents the conversations I've had with CEOs, and I don't think that represents the attitude of the industry as a whole. But step one for a CEO of any company is to make sure they are looking after their customers. Yes, we can enforce. Yes, we can make sure we run compliance processes, but that is their day job.
Why do you think that was the answer we were given earlier? Are there companies that just are choosing not to follow the rules because they're going to go bust otherwise, or they don't care, or I don't understand the rationale for the evidence we had.
Look, I think the industry has been under enormous pressure. We have to accept that. I think there is still more to do to get pricing regulation right, to make sure the finances work properly in the sector. We accept that. But I don't think that represents a sector that I see today. I think there are problems, and we will root them out, and indeed we have done so. But you have to start, as a company, with doing what's right for a customer. So I simply don't accept the evidence that was given.
Okay. Jonathan, if you wouldn't mind, would you just mind giving the committee an update on the state of the supplier market, as you usually do? Thank you.
Yes, of course. Well, look, just to start, we recognise, and I'm sure everyone on this committee recognises, that customers are in an incredibly difficult position right now. So the gas crisis has had stages, and right now we are seeing the full impact on customers' bills. Now, I talk to customers almost every week, and I have talked to customers who've been put onto prepayment meters. I've talked to families who are in distress, and I've talked to businesses who face some of the big uplifts in charges that you've seen today. Now, before I get on to some of the questions around that and what it means for us, I thought I'd just talk about more broadly what's happening in the market itself. So you'll remember last time we were here and over summer, we thought that without the price guarantee, the price might be almost £6,000 a year for the average household. Now, there is some good news. I'm pleased to say that the market has changed quite significantly, and for the first time since the start of the gas crisis, we are seeing downward pressure on prices. Now, I've expressed in many committees the deep uncertainty in projections, and indeed, if you look at £6,000 versus where we are today, you can see how much variability there is in the market. But we do expect on existing projections that the price guarantee will be breached by the price cap in July, and indeed that means bills going down for customers and significantly reduces the fiscal cost of the price guarantee in the first place. Now, in thinking more broadly about the retail market, I just want to focus on three things. So first of all, standards of service. So we have carried out a series of compliance reviews. We have moved from being a reactive regulator that used to respond to individual complaints and try and resolve them to one that is looking across the market. And I think our message to the sector has been really clear. We need to see standards improve, particularly for the most vulnerable. So last year, we ran a review and we asked every company to demonstrate how they were going to improve their approach to more vulnerable customers. And I'm happy to expand on what we found and why we came to that conclusion. Equally, we have run reviews on direct debits, we have run reviews on treatment of customers in affordability issues, and indeed we will continue to do so. Now, I'm not pretending these reviews are perfect. They're a very different way of regulating. We're moving into conduct regulation as opposed to more reactive compliance regulation we had before. But in my mind, those are fundamental to make sure we unearth first and then drive up the standards we see in the industry. Second, touching on financial resilience, the committee and indeed all of us examined really carefully what happened in 2021, and I am pleased to say the sector is in a more financial resilient position today than it was when the crisis started. So we have seen dramatic changes in the market over the course of winter, with gas prices being 10-15 times their normal price at £6 a therm, and we haven't seen a major failure to date. That said, the sector does need to recapitalise. So using the powers we have today, plus the new rules that we are putting in place, we intend to make sure that happens. And then finally, and I think this was mentioned earlier, the future of pricing regulation and our thinking around what that might mean. Now, the price cap has done a good job for customers overall, particularly when the market was stable, but we believe that it has costs as well as benefits. So coming on to the question of how we might sort of evolve the market, we do think there is a case for examining more flexible pricing regulation that allows companies in the market to adapt more quickly to the circumstances around them. But we think that would need to be accompanied by more thinking around how you support vulnerable customers. And I've said publicly, we think a serious examination of a social tariff funded progressively is a way in which we might be able to tackle some of the issues really that are the root cause of what customers highlighted today. The last thing I would say, and I think this came up in the last session, we do need to focus on the issues being raised in the non-domestic and the business sector, as well as by domestic customers. So we have a series of reviews underway to look at behaviour in that part of the market, as well as the domestic market.
Thank you, and we'll touch on some of those points today.
Sure.
Just one final question from me. You've come to the committee previously, and we've talked about businesses going bust because of market conditions. Are you worried now that businesses will voluntarily close down their operations because they just don't think it's a viable business for them anymore? Will there be further consolidation in the number of energy suppliers?
So look, I think that's possible. So when I talked to many of the people who own businesses, and you saw the announcement of the review by Shell, for example, it remains a concern to us around the long-term sustainability and attractiveness of this market. Now, we will continue to do what we can in two ways, both in terms of evolving the existing price cap to make sure it's as flexible as possible, given some of the trade-offs there with customers themselves. But also, as we build financial resilience of the sector, I think it will become more compelling for investors to come into this market and make sure they can see a sustained profit and not one that's simply based on the volatility in the market.
Thank you. Alan Brown, please.
Thanks, Chair. National Energy Action estimate there's 6.7 million households in fuel poverty just now, to increase to 8.4 million come April. Citizen Advice estimate there's 2 million households self-disconnecting at least once a month. We've seen a massive increase in customers being forced onto prepayment meters. What's Ofgem's assessment? Is it as bad as these figures?
So, you know, when you step back from all of this and you look at the market as a whole, without a doubt, given the price guarantee at £2,500 a year, despite unprecedented support from government in this sector, there are many families who are facing a basic problem of affordability. So I thought that Gillian sort of outlined it really well. You know, I've sat in and spoken to customers where they work out their budgets, and those budgets are negative. Now, the question really underneath all of this is how do we, within the market, indeed within wider policy, want to address that issue? And one of the reasons,
do you agree with these, the scale of the problem? Like, you know, over 8 million households will go into fuel poverty come April.
I think there's,
you know, 2 million are self-disconnecting once a month. Is that the start reality of the position?
So we certainly accept that the scale of the problem is very large. I mean, there's lots of definitions of fuel poverty and how you might address it, but fundamentally, there are many people who have serious issues with affording their energy today.
Yeah, can I ask, so on self-disconnection, so if somebody can't afford to put money in their meter, they're choosing not to use energy, but they actually build up debt and standing charges, which makes it even more difficult for them to ever turn the heating back on. Is that just that somebody not accessing their energy builds up debt before they can, you know, that prohibits them from getting, you know, being able to heat their home again?
Yeah, look, we looked at the issue of standing charges last year, and we looked at how we were going to socialise the costs of the levy, for example, as part of that. And we'll continue to examine the right balance between standing charges and more variable charges. What that review uncovered, though, was actually by moving more of the cost onto variable charges, there are another set of customers who are significantly harmed. So, for example, if you're a disabled family, if you're a family that has someone who depends on electricity, that uses a lot of electricity, you were made quite significantly worse off versus some of the benefits of those who were in a normal average situation.
So where there should be a better targeted support then to help the disabled, if that was the case?
So my view with all of this is that if underneath all of these questions is a question of affordability, and that's what we need to focus on. So coming back to the idea of a social tariff, if you had a social tariff, if that were funded in a way that wasn't socialising that cost on other low-income families, then that'd be a way to tackle the fundamental problem, which is however you structure the charges, there are families who are struggling to pay.
And I'm just sticking with standing charges. People on prepayment meters pay a higher standing charge. You've defended that before, saying, well, it costs the energy companies more. Although it's arguable it's costing more when they can get smart meter prepayment modes, so the companies are actually getting money up front from these vulnerable customers. So again, is it just that people in prepayment mode pay higher standing charges, and the government says it's purely a matter for Ofgem, so is it purely an Ofgem's gift to ascertain that it's just that these people pay more in prepayment mode?
So we have had the principle that we reflect the costs that suppliers face when they're supplying energy, and our best estimate of the cost is that it's slightly higher for prepayment meters. But we are currently looking at that, and we are examining whether there is a case for a cross-subsidy within the industry that would equalise some of the costs between payment methods. Now, I don't want to overpromise on that because it's complex, and you would need transfers between companies. So, for example, we have companies in the market that just have prepayment meter customers. If it is reasonable, and we think that it is, that a levelised sort of price would mean they weren't able to recover their costs, we'd have to find some way to make that good, and it's that complexity that we're working with at the moment.
What's the time frame, given that you agree, you seem to broadly agree, you know, that nearly a third of households in fuel poverty, so what's the time frame for actually resolving these matters?
And that will take some time. I don't know if you want to comment on specifically the time, but it's something that would need to take months rather than weeks.
Absolutely agree. It's a months, not weeks issue, and it is really complex. And there'll be a lot of debate about that issue because we have to understand when we take that decision who those winners and losers are. And if we don't, we're not acting rationally as a regulator. And I am concerned that we will put some elements of society in severe difficulty by undertaking that change. We have to consider it in the round.
Equally, the longer we wait, the more people are forced onto prepayment mode and therefore paying these higher charges.
Yeah, and I think I'll come back to that point, though, that I sat in front of this committee, I think, in May last year, and we talked about the standing charge and how we apply the solar levy. And I said then we were looking at changing it. And quite frankly, I was in almost 98% expectation that we would make the change. The analysis showed us that prepayment meter customers in general were made slightly worse off by doing that rather than better off. So all we are saying is that these are complex issues, and when you make a cross-subsidy, when you make a transfer, that creates winners and losers, and that's what we need to look at in detail.
I find that surprising, but back yourself, Chair.
Thank you. Andy McDonald,
thanks, Chair. Last week you announced a review on self-disconnection, remote switching and forced installations and the checks and balances around a decision to put customers on a prepayment meter. And that we've heard widespread reports of vulnerable customers being forced on the prepayment meters for some time. Why has it taken until now, after the Secretary of State wrote to suppliers, for you to respond? You've already completed the market compliance review, looking at whether suppliers are adhering to their the licence conditions. Why is this going to be any different?
Well, if you go back and look at the middle of last year and the sorts of concerns we were being raised, the first thing we focused on was more broadly how vulnerable customers are treated. So that mandatory change to a prepayment meter is something that happens at the end of a process. So the first question you want to ask a supplier is, what are you doing when a customer is in financial distress, to find out their circumstances, to identify their vulnerabilities, and to make sure you tailor your response towards that. And that review found that every company needs to make improvements. What we're doing with this review is looking very precisely at the moment a prepayment meter is forced into someone's home, or indeed the switchover in a smart meter is forced into someone's home, to make sure those checks and balances are also being followed. If I were to describe, and Neil may want to expand on this, what I think we found overall is principally a lack of consistency within companies. So quite often you are relying on the person that you call and the quality of the person that you call to make sure that the systems and processes and governance are being followed. And quite often that's not the case.
Has advice called for a ban on the forced installation of prepayment meters until these supports are in place and we can be confident about it? Would you support that, or is it going to cause problems for energy suppliers in recovering debt?
Well, look, I mean, we've sat with charities, we've sat with the companies themselves, and we've tried to get under the skin of what we should do here. Now, there is something I will say that may not be popular here, but there are a group of customers who can afford to pay their bills who choose not to. And so everyone is agreed in those circumstances The mandatory switch to a prepayment meter is a reasonable response to families who can afford to pay. The question is how you identify a vulnerable group of customers and how you protect against those who face much more significant risks when you make that kind of decision. And so we think the right thing to do, first of all, we think so far the rules are there, they are in place. We will make sure through a detailed review that we assess whether they've been adequately followed, whether the transition to a prepayment meter genuinely is a last resort, and we will use enforcement action if we need to. And the one thing I welcome about Emma's comments is that we will be enforcing aggressively if we find that companies have not followed the right systems and processes in treating their customers. But in terms of what's good for the industry, in terms of the fact that we are seeing bad debt increase significantly, which ultimately every customer pays for, we need to get a balance here. We think principally this is a compliance issue. If we find the rules need changing, well, then we'll change the rules.
And can I just add to that, if I may, around the scope of the review, because I think that's really important. It is about the journey. So it's not acceptable that people are finding this a surprise. You know, a remote switch to a prepayment meter or somebody turning up on the door. There should be multiple contacts in that journey. So we are going to make sure that we do sample checking of of the customers that have been affected, actually look at that issue in detail and come up with the facts to enable us to take action. It also opens up a debate around toughening up our rules or changing our rules to be more prescriptive. And again, we have to think about the balance of that around, you know, creating a rule book that's hundreds of pages long and difficult to enforce versus the principles that are in here at the moment. But we welcome that debate. Our role is to make sure that we do drive the standards up, and this is clearly an issue that needs to be looked at.
In terms of driving standards up, we're hearing stories of direct debits being increased and suppliers sitting on cash unfairly. What is happening in that space? What action is being taken to make sure that doesn't happen?
I think there's quite a positive story about the compliance review and its impact as part of that, but Neil, perhaps you want to expand.
Yeah, absolutely. So the compliance reviews are about driving those standards up, as I've talked about. So we did the direct debit review. We agreed with all suppliers their improvement plans. We've checked off those actions. 50 of 56 are complete, which means that the standards for direct debits are improving across the industry. And 11 out of 16 audits that suppliers agreed to commit to have also been completed. So we have the fact base that we worked on. We've drove the processes. So that's the training of all of the agents across the industry. That's the controls in place over direct debits. That's the outcomes for customers, the management information being reviewed, the governance that exists over the process. And we'll continue to go through our monitoring data and re-review that to make sure that those direct debits that are increasing adjust. And you will on occasion see an odd direct debit increase. We know that happens if there's an issue with a meter or there's an underlying issue in something in the system. But what we're saying is if that's uncovered, you know, it should be clearly explained to a customer. It should be clearly understood about why that direct debit is increasing. And the result of our review, I think we've seen improvements over that review. I'll just stress again one more thing, that this is not just a point in time. We're just going to look at direct debits once. This is an ongoing process. It's a strategic process to go through customer journeys on a regular basis.
So
to make
if I
sure
ask you again, are suppliers sitting on deposits and hoarding cash that doesn't belong to them? That's just a question I'm asking. Is it happening? And if so, on what sort of scale?
We don't think so, and I'm happy to write to the committee with regards to the value of cash that's held on customer accounts as a result of direct debits, recognising there's a cycle throughout the year.
So I think that's the important thing to note, is the industry is likely to be building up customer deposits through summer. Those deposits are built up till sort of October, November time, and those are used to pay for energy in winter because most customers prefer to have their direct debits fixed monthly as a monthly payment across the year, and we all use much less energy in summer than in winter. What we don't think we're seeing systemically is credit balancing being built up in the way that we saw pre-2021, but we will keep that under review.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just very quickly, Jonathan, you said there were some customers that can afford to pay but won't pay, and that was part of the rationale for some of the actions energy companies are taking on debt collection. How can you possibly know that's the case?
So I think we've had this problem in the industry for a number of years, in the sense that this is an issue about how you manage your bad debt. So if you look back over a normal year, for example, around 20% of mandatory enforcement installation of normal prepayment meters is about the normal rate you would get, about 20% less than we've seen last year. So throughout the process, there are always case studies of customers who are able to pay, And the only argument I'm making here is if that is the case, then we think that an installation of a prepayment meter is a reasonable response. The balance of what's happened is something that we need to uncover during the review, and that's what we'll be doing.
The thing I'm struggling with is that if the rationale for a forced instalment of a prepayment meter is based on a case study or an assumption, you can't actually know, can you? You don't have access to people's incomes and outgoings. You don't know if people can afford or not to pay their energy bills. And I would assume, and again, this is an assumption, that most people that aren't paying their bills is because they can't afford to pay them. And so, do you see the point I'm trying to make? I struggle with the idea that you would allow forced installation of prepayment meters because there have been case studies in the past where some people can pay but don't.
So going back to what Ofgem can do, so the right to do this ultimately is protected by law. So it requires a change in the law to move away from that. So suppliers can install a meter, and that's set out in the Energy Act. The simple point I'm making, and it's a very simple point, which is if you have, let me put it this way, if you have a customer who is able to pay and chooses not to, then I believe this is a reasonable response for a supplier that has to manage its bad debt and has to manage its own financial situation, indeed is obliged to do so. Now, the balance of how many customers there are in the market who are like that is something we'll uncover in the review. But if you look back over a number of years, this has been a response that suppliers have had. And I think from the evidence I've seen, from the discussions we've had indeed with consumer groups, that those customers exist, and if they do exist, this feels like a reasonable response. What we can't do, and you're right, Chair, is say out of the households we've seen last year, there is X percent that we know can afford their bills and Y percent that don't. But that's part of what we'll be testing.
Okay, thank you. Ruth Edwards, please.
Thank you, Chair. How would you describe the culture in the energy industry, going back to the comments earlier from Energy UK?
So honestly, I'm quite disappointed by the comments that we had today, and it feels like a step backwards. I think I came in 2021 and I expressed concerns about not only the culture, but the relationship with the retail business and with the regulator and with government. Now, I think we've made a lot of progress over the last year and a half, where all of us have had to work together collaboratively to solve a whole set of problems. How we're going to evolve pricing regulation? How are we going to design financial regulation that does move the market to a better place? And indeed, how do we address some of the issues around customer standards? What concerns me is if the industry's answer is genuinely, well, the regulator should force us to look after vulnerable customers, then there is still a long way to go before we get the right culture in this part of the industry.
And from your experience as the regulator, is that something, do you think that's a fair assessment of the culture in the industry or not?
So personally, I think that is not a good representation of where the industry is, but the fact that the trade body is putting it that way deeply concerns me.
Thank you. The Energy UK also criticised some of the criteria you used in your market compliance reviews. What's your response to that?
Well, if the committee will indulge me, I'll just describe the normal process when we go through enforcement. So it's almost like the stages of grief. So the first stage is you've got your facts wrong. The second stage is, well, everybody else is doing it. Then the third stage is, well, the harm wasn't that bad. So quite frankly, I think that Energy UK are on the first stage. Now, it's not to say that our methodology is perfect. These are quite new and quite fundamental changes to the way that we regulate. But the truth is, the complaints always come when you find someone in the seriously unsatisfactory category. And that's where usually your methodology is questioned. If I had a kind of comment on what I've seen, and Neil and I are debating this, and he may disagree actually, I do think we need to think about how we adapt to the different business models that are in the market. So when you're looking at governance processes and you are looking at the way in which companies approach things, there is a risk you go for a more traditional assessment rather than being broader for the newer companies that are in the market. So one of the things we're exploring is how do we get a more outcome-focused approach to the compliance reviews that we're doing.
I'd certainly like the approach to evolve to take into account other people's views around the service metrics as part of the assessment. And I think we have to really, really get better at that sampling methodology. I think we need to get better at kind of the analytics around the data that's all available. We're making improvements. We are bringing in individuals into those teams to do that. But this will be an ongoing process. And if we can get that all working correctly, then the service standards do improve over all suppliers. Will be in a much better space. But I appreciate it does take time.
Thank you. We've been discussing higher prices paid by customers on prepayment meters. But we've also been told that customers paying by cash or cheque pay up to £254 more a year than customers on a direct debit. Do you think this is justified? I appreciate it's a more expensive way of paying, but it does seem to be a huge premium.
So again, Neil will expand on this. We are concerned about the way the methodology has evolved, and part of the methodology for standard credit customers does scale with the cost of energy. But what we want to do is look across all payment methods and see whether there is a case for levelling them. But as I say, there are trade-offs there. First of all, the complexity of some companies having to pay other companies for who have different proportions of different kinds of customers. And secondly, we need to remember the incentive effects here. So originally, when these differentials were made, part of that was encouraging people onto direct debits. But I think, personally, we're at the limit point where actually if you are on standard credit, it is unlikely that you're going to move to another form of payment because it simply is part of the way you manage your budgets and the way you want to run your life.
I suppose my concern is that a lot of older customers also might be paying, for example, by cheque. I mean, to me, £254 sounds like a really nosebleed price for that difference. What's your view, Neil?
So yeah, I absolutely understand there is a proportion of society that that do choose cash cheque, and they have a belief that that's the way you should do things. There's been a lot of work in the industry to try and encourage, to try and correct the belief that that's a good way of managing your money. If you can afford to go on direct debit, it's cheaper, and to kind of get that set of customers, particularly to migrate to that smart world where there's more protections in place. I think we could go further in that space. We could look more at what companies could do to incentivise, and ultimately we need to have a look at the underlying cost models. But it is complex. There are industry charges in those different product types that differ. There are also different debt levels that need to be cross-subsidised. So it's a really complicated change to make. And Jonathan's right; it could involve cross-subsidisation across companies, which will be really, really complex to implement, and it won't be a short fix.
Do you think you're likely to persuade older customers who perhaps don't use the internet to go onto a direct debit payment?
I mean, the point I would make is that that's why we think we're at the limit of worrying about the incentive effects, because we're at the limit of, in a sense, the number of people who would now make that transition, which is why it feels right to us to have a look across all payment methods and see whether they should be equalised.
And just a quick final supplementary, Chair. Did I understand right from your opening comments that you expect the price cap to come down in July?
So we expect the price cap to be below the new level of the energy price guarantee, which is £3,000 in July. So we are seeing the first signs, perhaps, of the market easing.
And I think a lot of people find it difficult to understand why, when the wholesale price starts to rise, the energy price cap goes up very quickly. But when the wholesale price has fallen, it seems to take many, many months to filter through to consumers. Can you just set out why that is? I'm
really happy to. The formula we use for the price cap is fixed. You know, it changes a little bit, but it's broadly the same. So the truth is the price cap didn't rise when the market prices first rise. In fact, there was almost a 6-month delay before prices went up. Now, what it does is it says the best way to manage risk is to ask companies to buy forward, to buy energy in the market for 3 months or 6 months' time. What that does mean is when prices fall, it takes 3 to 6 months for that to unwind, to go back into customers' bills. So there are small changes to the formula, but the formula going up is exactly the same as the formula coming down.
And importantly, when the crisis began and the gas prices started rising, we had a 6-month price cap formula. So the lag was actually 6 to 8 months. And through the crisis, to make the price cap actually more resilient in the face of this volatility, we compressed that, and it's now a quarterly price cap. There are lead times, but it's now sort of 3 or 4 month lead time. So prices will fall for consumers if market prices stay at the sort of levels they're coming down to now.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've only got about 10 minutes left, so about 5 minutes each. So Ian Lavery, please.
Thanks. I think it's fair to say that Ofgem supports the introduction of a social tariff.
So just to clarify,
and I'm just wondering whether you could tell the Select Committee if you're working with the government with regards to a social tariff. If you are, what do you think the design possibly could be, and are you looking towards specific individuals being targeted?
So Just stepping back from all of this, we do think there is merit in looking at a social tariff. We haven't done all the detailed work behind it that you'd need to do, or indeed traded it off against other interventions the government might be contemplating, such as changes to benefits and other ways of supporting vulnerable customers. But just to expand a bit on why that is the case. So why would you go for a price-based intervention rather than one sort of driven by fiscal decisions and what you normally do when you're concerned about families in poverty across the country? And the reason for me is that even though benefits can be uprated by inflation, the difference in the scale of energy use between two different households in basically the same income circumstances can be very large. So if you're living in a well-insulated flat with a family of three, in modern housing that is well-equipped, your energy bill is fundamentally different from a family in drafty, poor energy-efficient social housing who have other energy needs, such as disabled children. Now, the only way I can see of making sure that the support matches that difference is to have something that intervenes in the price that those customers pay. And that's why we think, if you are going to think about the future of pricing regulation, and I agree almost with the question that was asked in the last session around pricing regulation, we think broadly for most customers, at least something that is more flexible and more adaptable. It's right to focus on the affordability issue, which is ultimately goes beyond regulation to something that is subsidised. In terms of the design, I think, in principle, I support what Citizens Advice were suggesting about the way you might do it. The thing I would like to see, and this is a big challenge, is making sure that those customers who receive a social tariff don't miss out on the new world that we're hoping comes into place. So Emma mentioned the flexibility initiatives, for example, where many of us will be turning off our lights and using less energy between 5 and 6. This is the sort of world we're moving to, and I would like a system whereby the most vulnerable customers can absolutely benefit from that kind of future for the retail market. In terms of who's targeted, that's a massive question. My starter for 10, but it's no more than that. It's a personal starter for 10 rather than a big sort of Ofgem sort of detailed piece of work, is you probably need to attach it to some other existing indicator of income, which means looking particularly at those who are receiving benefits. But all of that is up for debate, and all of that is something that I think we need to work through.
Do you think a social tariff should replace the existing price cap? And if there was a social tariff, how quickly do you think it could be implemented?
So I think we need to think seriously about the costs and the benefits of the price cap for customers today. So it has done a good job, particularly when the market was stable. But just to explain why we think it has costs for customers, if you have a fixed price for everybody and you have a volatile market, the only thing we can do as a regulator to make sure that we don't see a repeat of 2021 is to ask companies to hold significantly more capital. Now, if they hold more capital, they hold more money within the company, ultimately that needs to pay someone a return, otherwise that capital simply won't be invested, and that costs customers money. So the trade-off we've got to make between the price cap and the alternatives is whether those costs are beginning to outweigh the benefit. The second thing I'd say, and probably one of the least popular things Ofgem has done, is introduce the market stabilisation charge, which is the charge between different suppliers when someone moves from one to the other. Certainly at times like now where you see prices falling. Again, these are secondary and tertiary impacts of the price cap that are important to assess to make sure you can look at the alternatives. When I look at the alternatives, you can go right the way from going back to focus on pricing behaviour, so something like you do in the insurance market, so preventing what was called the acquisition tariff, so what was called bait and switch, where a company would give you a low offer for a year, but slowly transition you to a much higher price, right the way through to things like relative price caps, which are a bit more adaptable to the market that's in place. But I think if you do that, then you have to address the affordability issues, and ultimately for me that means seriously examining a social tariff.
Just quickly, how quickly could a tariff be implemented then?
Well, I think that there's a lot of detailed work that needs to be done to answer that question. All I'd say is the energy price guarantee was implemented in a matter of weeks and months. So, we need to work with government, and it needs to be urgent.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Mark Pawsey, please.
Mr. Brearley, you told us what you thought about Emma Pinchbeck's evidence. What did you make of what Kate had to say, UK hospitality, and alarmingly, this business that if hospitality company went out to get 6 quotes, 4 people wouldn't bother?
So I think this is a real substantive issue, and she mentioned what we did in November to begin to start to address it. I think you've got to look at both sides of this, though. So if you go back into the market, say in August, you had prices at £6 a therm. It was incredibly hard for any retailer to genuinely be able to hedge a contract that they were passing through at a fixed price to a business customer. So what we've got to unpack is really two big things that I think are of concern to us. The first is around whether or not companies abused the fact that other companies weren't offering tariffs and so simply jacked up their prices.
There's some companies abuse the fact that they can demand huge upfront payments.
Right. I mean, all of that needs to be looked at and simply say, if you're in a market, you know your competitors aren't bidding, then you'll behave in a different way. And we need to frankly see whether there was market abuse at that time.
Do you think you've got enough powers currently to get involved in that sector, or would you like to see an extension of your powers to regulate the supply to non-domestic customers?
Well, we already regulate what's called the deemed rate, which is almost the rate you're put on if a supplier doesn't offer you a fixed tariff, and that is something that we're reviewing and we're looking at. The question as to whether we need more powers is more broadly where. So one thing I would be cautious about, I'm not saying we're completely against it, and we need to do the work with the Treasury to assess this, but I'd be cautious about further pricing regulation in the market until we have something that works.
Arguably, haven't you got enough on your plate already without extending powers into this sector?
So we have plenty on our plate now. The question really is, has the behaviour of the companies really...
Okay, and part of your role is to protect vulnerable customers. Shouldn't we say that, tough business people should be able to deal with all of these issues themselves? Why do they need you to get involved?
So that's the framing. I think the piece that I think we need to look at is micro businesses and small and medium-sized enterprises where there is a case for that. But we've had this conversation again. We debate all this within the building. There is a risk. If you continue to regulate for every problem that you see on behalf of a customer, you end up with a much bigger rule book than the one you have today.
All right, thanks, Jeff.
Thank you. Two last very quick questions and answers. One, if the energy companies are not making any profit, how easy is it for them to capitalise their business to the levels you need?
So this is the ongoing kind of iteration of pricing regulation that we need to make. So if you look at what happened last year, where I think sort of Q3, I think many companies were on track to make a profit for that year. But simply because of the warm winter and the low prices in the market, many of them were unable to do so. And again, it comes back to, Chair, the interaction of the price cap with the market that we're seeing. Now, we will adapt to that, so we will pass through reasonable costs when we iterate the price cap next time, and we have done previously. And I'd argue we have a good reputation with the industry for doing that. But ultimately, this will come down to whether or not you need to put more into the price cap to raise prices for customers to offset some of these risks. And that's why we're saying perhaps pricing regulation in this way is too rigid for the sort of market we have today.
And lastly, you said earlier that a social tariff should be funded progressively. Does that mean your personal view is it should be funded by general taxation?
You know, I'm teetering on the brink of Ofgem's job here, but what I struggle to see is that a social tariff being funded by other people's bills. So we've done the analysis, we've looked at it as a board, and it is very hard to see how you would charge quite significantly more to a customer, say, on $18,000 a year, to fund a customer who's on $14,000 a year through a series of benefits. And so, to me, if you're going to provide support, it's best done progressively.
Okay, we could keep going, but I'm afraid we've timed out, so we'll no doubt see you again later in the year. Thank you to all three of you for your contributions today. Thank you for members to keeping us to time. I'll call the session now to an end. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.